Hi, I'm Marina Gavito with the innovation team at USAA, and I'm here today to interview Sheryl Sculley.
Hi, I'm Sheryl Sculley, former city manager of the city of San Antonio and author of my new book, Greedy Bastards.
So let's jump right in. The title, Greedy Bastards. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, it was inspired by the police union president back in 2014. He accused my team and I of portraying the union leadership and the members as greedy bastards. And of course, we didn't do that. We were talking about changing old business models and changing something that's been in place for more than 25 years. It was certainly a hardball experience, and I think the title reflects that. But I remember seeing the video of the union president saying that at the time, and I joked with my staff and said, if I ever write a book, I think I'll use that as the title. And so here we are in 2020, and yes, I did.
Nice.
I did use it.
Yeah, it was definitely intriguing. Speaking of books, I read that you're a big fan of Jim Collins' book, Good to Great. What other books or podcasts do you recommend?
Yeah, he also wrote Great by Choice, and he also did a public sector version, a monograph about discussing leadership in the public sector as well. And I've used that with my executive team at the city. I still talk about them as though they're still my team, even though I retired last year. But he's great. I'm also reading right now a book by Rosabeth Moss Cantor, Think Outside the Building, and it's about different leadership styles and working in this environment that we're in today. And of course now with the experience of COVID, we know that we have to change old business models, and it takes different leadership styles to be able to do that. So that's very good. There's another leadership book by Doris Kearns Goodwin, just called Leadership. And it examines 4 presidents, and I read that off and on. I like to take a look at different people in executive positions and how they function under duress. And this one covers Abraham Lincoln, FDR, Teddy Roosevelt, and LBJ. And they all had very distinct and different styles, but handled adversity in good ways.
Yeah.
So those are a couple of books that I'm taking a look at now.
Nice, thanks for sharing. So diving into the union piece, it was a complex issue because of financially speaking, but also it was kind of a long-standing issue. So it was almost like the city was breaking a habit. From the fire and police side, they could say, you don't want to be against a police or firefighter, which is a simple message to say, and most of the city would say, no, we don't want to be against police and firefighters. From your perspective and all the lessons that you learned, what can you share with us on how we can share complex messages and simplify complex messages, really?
That's a complicated challenge.
Yeah.
First, let me say that I'm not against police and fire.
Right.
I highly regard their work. I'm grateful for their service. I recommended, and the city council approved, nearly 700 new police and fire personnel during my tenure. In fact, when I came to San Antonio, I thought we were understaffed. I didn't think we had enough personnel on the street, and so I recommended making those changes and adding. It's a core business of the city and a very important one. The service also has to be affordable to the taxpayers. And it was somewhat academic, but as I uncovered these contracts and I was trying to figure out early in my tenure in San Antonio, where was the money going? Because we were growing very quickly, one of the fastest growing cities in the country. Before the Great Recession, we had a lot of income coming into the city, but we still had so many great needs throughout the city, especially in terms of infrastructure. You know, roads that needed repair, drainage issues in all parts of the city, more parkland, more libraries. And so as we examined it, I saw these contracts, which I thought were excessive, nothing that I had ever experienced. And so I believed that a data-driven, very transparent process could bring us to consensus on how we needed to go forward. But there I was mistaken. The unions dug their heels in and said, no, we don't want any change. We were able to get these contracts back in 1988, and they viewed it as a forevermore situation. But the academic exercise that I presented to the city council was, when does public safety consume 100% of the city's general fund budget? And in that 10-year analysis, it was 2031. If we did a 15-year, it was 2040. If we threw in a recession, it was 2024. And so I knew that it wasn't going to bankrupt the city during my tenure as city manager, but I also was aware of the financial legacy I would leave. And no one before me had tried to tackle this or take it on for all kinds of reasons, but I felt a responsibility to do that. And I thought I had the experience. I began my career in Michigan, one of the toughest labor states in the country, served the city of Kalamazoo, Michigan for 15 years and dealt with very strong unions. I also come from a union family. I'm not anti-union. My father was a union member and a union leader. So I felt that I had the experience between Kalamazoo, Michigan, Phoenix, Arizona, where police and fire also had collective bargaining, and here in Texas. But this was a tough fight.
Yeah,
we did prevail in the end and saved the city more than $150 million just in the 5-year term of the current contracts, and yet there's more work to do.
So on that, what else needs to change in public safety contracts going forward?
So let me focus on the police contract.
Sure.
One of our priorities back in 2014 was the disciplinary process. It is very one-sided toward the officers, and as our police chief, Bill McManus, one of the first people I hired and recruited to San Antonio, has said good cops don't need that kind of protection. And so what happens is that the entire personnel file cannot be used in a disciplinary arbitration. And the police officers appeal almost every discipline and certainly all of the terminations. And what happens is a third-party independent arbitrator comes to San Antonio. He's not from here or she's not from here. They review portions of the file, only what's permitted under the contract to be shown. And then some of these bad officers get reinstated. And oftentimes the chief will make a decision that those officers should not go back on the street, and so he assigns them to desk duty, and they're sitting in an office shuffling paper, and because they could harm the public. And so the chief needs to have the authority to take disciplinary action, and that is important, and is especially important now following the George Floyd killing, Memorial Weekend, and the protests that occurred thereafter. The public is demanding accountability of our police officers, and I know that the chief and I and my successor, Eric Walsh, Maria Villagomez, deputy manager over police and fire, we all agree that there are additional changes in that contract that need to be made. It was a priority back in 2014, but because the fight was so difficult to make the financial changes, once we achieved that in the summer of 2016 through a mediated court-ordered settlement, I think the mayor and council, even the community, had grown weary of the fight and said, accept what we were able to get at this point, we'll come back and get that in the next contract. That next contract is coming due in 2021. So there is more work to do in that regard. And I think we'll hear more from the community that they're demanding it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was interesting, the timing of it all. And when I was reading it, it was interesting to see all of the back and forth with the unions and how you navigated it. I also thought this book is just as much about female leadership in the workplace as it was about the actual contract negotiations with the union. One of the quotes I saw you reference in the book was by Brandy Chaston, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, where it says, "You have to be brave enough to be vulnerable. Vulnerability is not a weakness. It's an opportunity for high reward." Can you tell us more about this quote and why you cited it?
Well, taking on something like this requires courage.
Yeah.
And when I began, first thing I did was talk with my team, and we discussed it as to whether or not and I say we because we did this as a team. Obviously, I was the city manager and the leader, but I wanted to know their thoughts, and we all agreed that we should take this on, that we were in a position to do it. And I said to them up front, this may not end well. It could be very negative for many of us, but it's something that we should do. It was the right thing to do for the community. As you know, I dedicate the book to the residents of San Antonio because we took on this challenge for them to protect them financially. I also dedicate it to the rank and file within the public safety departments, police and fire, because they keep us safe. But it has to be affordable to the taxpayers, and it needs to be competitive and reasonable. So we knew going into this that it might not end well, and I think Brandy Chastain, would say that when they take on a major challenger in a soccer game, you never know who is to win. But there are great rewards, and we've seen that in U.S. women's soccer. And here we did prevail. There was a price to pay. It took a total of 6 years to get through with both unions, but we did better for the citizens of San Antonio.
Absolutely. So having the knowledge and experience that you have today, what advice or guidance would you give to your younger self?
To my younger self. Well, I talk a little bit about this in the book, that in this particular case, I think we needed a more formalized communication plan, and you just asked a question about communication. It's a complicated issue to talk about healthcare and its expense and the different kinds of plans, and we're hearing a lot about that, of course, nationally as well as Congress talks about affordable care and how we take care of our residents in the community, as well as our own employees. And we've seen that in big numbers now with the COVID pandemic. It's important, and it needs to be adequate to support our personnel, but it's complicated. And I think a more formalized plan would have enabled us to communicate better. And if you think back, now it's almost 10 years ago when we first started this, social media wasn't as prevalent, and that played a big part in this. There were all kinds of social media strategies, misinformation, people, detractors taking similar names in our website to put out misinformation. At one point, someone told me that they saw on social media that the unions were accusing me of being a member of ISIS. I mean, it was just outrageous stuff. And so a more formalized communication plan, because one example for you, in my communication with the public, there'd be a story in the paper, and of course the media wanted to sensationalize something that was outstanding in the conversation. And as they did that, I'd get a call from a business person who would say, "Is that really true?" And I'd say, "No, here's what's going on." And they said, "Well, why didn't the paper report that? Can you send me something in writing? I'd like to share that with some of my colleagues or other business people." And that list, people would call me from time to time, grew over the years to more than 500 people that I would send these periodic notes to say, here are the facts about what's going on. So I think that needed to be more formalized. I think what I would say to myself, if I were talking to my younger self, would be that, there's an old saying that you can't boil the ocean. You can't do it all at once. And And maybe what we took on was the biggest piece, and we needed to break it down into some smaller pieces first. It kind of happened naturally, but I think making sure that your plan is reasonable to accomplish. And there's nothing wrong with starting small and building on success. So I would advise to really study the plan. But in the end, if the data supports what you're doing, if it's the right thing to do for your business, organization, or for your community, and you have the support, then go forward with it.
Yeah.
Don't second guess yourself.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I also really liked how you discussed in the book the seasons of life that you're in, you know, and whether you want to tackle a big fight, if, for instance, you have young kids or, you know, that kind of stuff. And so it was interesting how it all aligned for you to take that on.
Yeah,
So-
you have to pick and choose your
Sure.
battles. I don't think that they would have treated a man the way they treated me. I mean, there was so much sexism involved in this. At one point, a council member told me that the unions told, or some union members told him they didn't want to lose to a girl.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, oh gosh, you know, I'm a 60-year-old woman and I'm still facing this.
I
They don't
know,
want to
right?
lose to a
Yeah.
girl. But yeah, there were some pretty dark and
Yeah.
vicious and personal attacks. But the part about, for a woman, the seasons of your life, that is important. And it's okay. I would say to other women, I was the first woman in every position that I earned, but for the one coming here. And over my 45-year career in public management, and it's okay to lean in, lean out, depending on where you are in your life. In Kalamazoo, I was a city manager when my kids were born, and I worked until I was in labor. In fact, I was in the office the day my son was born. I knew I was in labor, but my daughter was older and I had a long labor, so I wasn't in a
Yeah.
hurry to get to the hospital. Not that I encouraged
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
but when I went to Phoenix, my kids were young, and I went as a deputy city manager, and people questioned me at the time and said, "You're a city manager, why would you go to be a deputy city manager?" And I said, well, first of all, I wanted a big city growth experience. I grew up in the Chicago area, I worked in Michigan. I had a lot of experience at cutback management and working in the Rust Belt, and I wanted some growth management experience, and Phoenix was considered one of the best managed cities in the country, and so they recruited me, and I took a look at it, and we moved across the country. My husband quit his job, but being in that second position just gave me a few ounces of opportunity to spend a little bit more time with my
Yeah.
family, and that's okay to do that.
Yeah.
When I was recruited to San Antonio, my kids were off to college, and so it was a different phase in our lives, and it made sense to do this. Plus, my daughter was already a sophomore at the University of Texas, so
Yeah.
it was wonderful to be close to her.
Nice. So what do you think the next stage of or level of female inclusion in the workplace looks like?
Yeah, I think there will be many more women, and they will be in leadership positions. And I say that because so many companies now are embracing women's leadership programs. I'm proud to say that we started a women's leadership mentoring program at the city quite a few years ago. And we pair senior executives with junior members of our professional team. And we meet with those individuals on at least a monthly basis, sometimes more often, and they work on projects together. We expose them to different aspects of the organization, also bring in outside speakers that can talk about leading in their business organizations. The program's been very successful, and we've been able to retain a high percentage of these women, and they've been able to achieve promotions. So I think that as companies do that, I think we will see more women in leadership positions throughout our community, whether it's in business or in the public sector. And
Yeah.
I'm pleased with that.
Yeah.
And of course, we have more women on the city council today
Yeah,
as well.
true. That's
So we're seeing greater interest, and I think that will only grow over time.
Nice. So I also read in the book that you brought the rock and roll marathon to San Antonio, and I'm a big time runner too. I've only run Boston once. You've done it twice. So 2 questions. Where is your favorite place to run a marathon outside of San Antonio? And what's your PR? Personal record.
Yeah, we're talking running lingo
Running
here.
lingo, sorry.
Yes, we runners do that. Well, outside of Boston and San Antonio, and I wouldn't say I personally brought it, but people knew I was a marathon runner
Sure.
when I came to San Antonio, and so the running community asked me to help. Can we make this better and bigger? And we worked with San Antonio Sports. Dr. Susan Blackwood was head of that at the time, and Penny Postoke Ferguson, my assistant city manager, and I worked on the RFP and brought the rock and roll here back in 2008. So besides San Antonio and Boston, I really enjoyed the Marine Corps Marathon in Washington, D.C. And probably because I work in government work, and I'd been to Washington so many times, but it was lovely. It started out at Arlington National Cemetery, and we ran around the Pentagon and just all aspects, the National Forest and across the bridges, all the monuments, Georgetown, the Capitol. And I actually requalified for Boston in that race. I knew that if I could get to the Washington Monument under 3 hours, I could requalify, and I was at about 250 there. So I kind of eased up a little bit and made it back. But you know how it is at the end of the race.
Yeah.
It was a little bit uphill getting back into Arlington, and the crowd was like, I was kind of chugging up the hill at that point, and they said, "Don't stop, you're almost there." And I'm thinking, yeah, right, you didn't run 26 miles just now. But
I think the same thing all the time.
yeah, right. But the Marines actually work the race, as you know, they volunteer and work all the stations, and so it was a really beautiful race, and I highly recommend it.
Nice, yeah.
Marine Corps is a great race.
Yeah, I always tell myself if I run another marathon, it's going to be that one.
Yeah.
And I actually qualified for the New York City Marathon. I didn't know you could qualify with my time in the San Antonio Rock and Roll Half.
Oh, that's great. Oh, that's wonderful. Well, my marathon PR to qualify for Boston, I ran a 3:40.
Yeah.
And I was 47
Nice.
when I qualified the first time. I didn't run my full marathon till after I turned 40. And I ran the Chicago Marathon, was my first one. I was living in Phoenix at the time, and the marathon was the weekend of my mother's birthday in October. And so I thought, as a multitasker that I could run the marathon, celebrate my mother's birthday with her. And I did, and I actually trained. I followed Joan Benoit Samuelson's. She wrote a book, the first woman to win the Olympic gold marathon in Los Angeles. That was the first time in our lifetime, that women were allowed to run marathons and compete in the Olympics. And she won, and I followed her training program methodically.
Yeah.
And finished the Chicago Marathon. I had been a 10K competitive runner in my 30s and 40s, and I thought, yeah, can I run that far? Let me see. And it wasn't so bad, and then I ran New York.
Yes.
And then I thought, I could do this competitively. Got a little cocky. And anyway, I qualified for Boston and
That's
did that.
awesome.
Yeah, and I'm not running those distances anymore, and I miss it. I miss it a lot. But my body is not allowing me to run that far anymore.
Yeah, I recently actually joined the Downtown Run group here, and Carlos Contreras and his wife run with it every once in a while. And there's half marathon training and then full marathon training, and the team is just pulling me for the full marathon training, and I'm just like, I'm not sure I want to run a full marathon quite yet, but I'm training for it, so I might as well.
Good for you.
We'll see how that goes. So with running, how do you think running has helped shape your decision-making process along your career?
It is what has saved me. Really in this work. It's very stressful, but I can do a long run and think through issues. I've put together presentations in my mind as I run. I've thought through complicated personnel issues, and can then come back and think, okay, I know which way I'm going.
Yeah.
And so it's been a reliever. Plus it gets me out and about, because at City Hall you end up sitting in meetings and you are running around going to different places, but there's a lot of sitting and not as much exercise in the sense there isn't the physical labor, mental stress for sure, mental labor, but so running has really been a lifesaver for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time, and thanks for going over all of this with us. We really appreciate it.
Well, it's my pleasure and honor, and I hope people read the book.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's really a history lesson for people in San Antonio, especially younger people who weren't here in 1988 when these contracts were put in place, and have seen the evolution of the city. But also the kinds of changes that we made and the kinds that can be made, changing those old business models to be more innovative, as we need to be.
Yeah, and I found it was just, I mean, I couldn't put the book down. And also, I think what you were mentioning earlier with the police contracts, how timely it is. So it was definitely interesting to read the context and having lived in San Antonio during that time, hearing the bits and pieces of messaging and then seeing another perspective of it was fascinating.
Yeah, I left behind a really strong team. When I was recruited in 2005, the council didn't consider people inside the organization for city manager. So I knew my work was cut out for me when I came to San Antonio, and that I would not have done my job if I didn't leave behind several people who could become city manager. And I'm proud to say that all 6 of my deputy and assistant managers applied for my job, were interviewed, and they selected one from among my team to be city manager. So I'm proud of that, and I know they'll do a great job. In fact, they have since I left.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
As a former city manager, does it, just watching everything happen, kind of kick things into gear, as you know?
For me, mentally?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, for the first 2 months of COVID, I felt like I needed to be at City Hall and be in charge.
Yeah.
And Eric and I have talked. We talk fairly regularly, and I talk with the other staff as well. I try not to interfere. If they ask me a question, I'm more than happy to give them advice as to how I think things should be done. But they're extremely capable, and they're doing an excellent job. And I think Mayor Nierenberg is also providing great leadership during this pandemic. So that's all gone well. But there is an email that we get weekly where city managers can call in and say, hey, what has someone done with regard to quick testing? How many sites do you set up? How did you go about it? And then other city managers will chime in and offer suggestions as to how they're going about that particular issue or challenge. And it's been interesting to read. That didn't occur when I was a city manager over years, and now during the pandemic that's happened. And I expect that will continue even after COVID, because there will be, unfortunately, probably more pandemics and other climate-related things happening, similar to what's happening out in California, Northern California right now with the fires. So it's a good thing.
Yeah, I was wondering if that was a normal thing to be so open source and sharing information.
Oh,
or
yes.
if that was definitely brought on by this need to make sure everyone has the best practices.
Yeah.
And I think people in those roles will know right away.
Right.
And I think it's wonderful. And I always wonder that because I saw a panel with the city mayors, and I was wondering, are they sharing information? Are they talking to each other every day?
Yeah, I don't know if they talk every day as much. And there has been, it's called the Innovation Alliance through the International City Management Association. And we've been members of that, San Antonio, for a long time. It was started back when I was in Phoenix. So it's been around, and that is exactly what you're talking about, the sharing of best practices. And I always told my staff, it's not about thinking of something new. It's about examining others who are doing it well and tailoring it to your own organization on how you can go forward. So, those groups are out there. And the big city managers get together twice a year and share best practices, also talk about big challenges, commiserate a little bit too.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a
Yeah,
bit of
and
that.
this issue of police and fire union contracts has been on the agenda for more than 10 years, 15 years that I've been here in San Antonio because there were cities that were going bankrupt on the West Coast and East Coast because of those contracts. So it's been something city managers have been talking about for a long time. And we've all had our challenges dealing with the issues, but I decided that I was in a position to be able to take this on and did, and I just didn't think it would take 6 years. I thought it would take maybe 2 years and then I could retire. I wanted to retire a few years ago because I was being recruited to corporate boards, but I couldn't do that as long as I was working in the public sector.
Oh, okay.
So since I retired, I have joined a corporate board. I've been recruited by a couple of others, and I'm considering those. But I was busy working on my book this past year,
Yeah.
and I wanted to get that out because it does provide lessons learned for other city managers.
And I'm not an aspiring city manager by any means, and I moved to San Antonio in 2017. So for me, it was really informative of knowing what happened when you came
Before.
here and
Yeah.
before, and how it's progressed, and
Right.
things that still need to change, and things that I, as like a young person who is going to live here long term, needs to pay attention to.
Right.
So
Well, that's why I said it's a history lesson for people who weren't here back in 1988 or even here in 2005 when I was recruited
Yeah.
to San Antonio.
So I want to say thank you to Lorenzo Gomez, because he was the one who introduced me to this book and talks such great things about you. And then also
he's a good friend.
it speaks for itself in its book. So I'm
Yeah,
glad that I
actually,
could do
he
that.
and Graham introduced me to Scribe, my publisher,
Yes.
several years ago. And J.T. McCormick had been bugging me, are you going to write that book? And I said, not until I retire. Yeah, here it is, out there, published. And now they're trying to talk me into doing another book, so we'll see.
Another book or a podcast. I'm sure you have
Or a
so many
podcast.
stories to tell.
Yeah, I've done several of those too. In fact, I've been overwhelmed with the response to the book. I've done literally either TV, media interviews, podcasts, or virtual events every day since the book launched in August. So it's been crazy. And now I'm being approached by universities that are including the book in their
Oh,
syllabus
that
and
would be
want me to
amazing.
guest lecture. I taught a government management class at the LBJ school at the
Okay.
University of Texas for 3 years in 08, 09, and 10. Once I took on this challenge, I couldn't make the time to continue doing that, but I'm in conversation with them now about doing a seminar on the book and perhaps teaching again. So
Oh, wonderful. Well, I'm an
Yeah.
alumni there, so I'm biased, and I think that's great.
You're at what?
I'm an alumni.
Oh,
I
good.
graduated from University of Texas.
Oh, okay, good.
So, like your daughter.
Yes.
From advertising, not
Okay.
from public affairs or anything
All right.
like that. But I know all of those programs. Again, I'm biased that we've got some of the top programs in the nation. So
Yeah.
it's wonderful. If
It
we
is.
could have something.
And a man by the name of Stephen Pedigo is now leading the, it's an urban fellow program there. It's about city management, local issues. So many people, when I taught at LBJ, think they're policy wonks and they're going to go to the federal government and change the world, change
Right.
the country.
Right.
But very few people get to do that, and there's so much action and involvement at the local level. I just love it because that's what affects people's lives every single day. I mean, you turn on the water, we pick up the garbage, you drive on the streets, you use a park, you go to business that may have been helped by the city in terms of our development services operation.
The library.
The libraries, everything, that you do in your daily life is related to local government. And so it's very important, and to be involved, to be aware of what's going on. So I'm glad you enjoyed the book, and I hope others read it as well.
Well, thank you.